My name is Claire, 33 years old, and somehow still dealing with the pure audacity of my own family. I was not invited to my sister's wedding in Paris, the exact same wedding I was manipulated into paying for. She actually had the nerve to tell me by email writing that if I wanted to be part of her big day, I could just look up the venue on Google Earth. So I simply replied, "Sure, enjoy your big day." The next morning, she would not stop calling me. But me, I woke up to 99 missed calls. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who took your generosity for granted. Trust me, you will want to hear how I handled what came next. The conflict started on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in the Delta Sky Club lounge at John F. Kennedy International Airport. My designer garment bag was draped carefully over the chair next to me, holding a custom silk dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. The ambient noise of the terminal hummed in the background as I sipped a glass of sparkling water, waiting for my red-eye flight to Charles de Gaulle. As a financial risk consultant handling multi-million-dollar portfolios, my life is strictly scheduled and highly stressful. I had cleared my entire week, handed off 2 massive corporate merger accounts to my junior partners, and packed my bags to support a family that never really supported me. I pulled out my phone to check my flight status. Instead, a new email notification popped up on my screen. It was from my younger sister Brittany. The subject line read, "Important update about Paris." There was no greeting. There was no warmth. Just a block of text that immediately made my blood run cold. Brittany wrote that after a long discussion with her fiancé Jamal, they had decided it was best if I did not come to France. She claimed that this was her moment to shine as an aspiring lifestyle influencer, and she needed the aesthetic to be absolutely perfect. According to her, my serious corporate energy would completely ruin the vibe of her royal wedding content. She literally typed, "If you want to see the flowers, you can watch through the Google Earth window, laughing out loud. Do not get on the plane." And right below her signature, Jamal had added his own little footnote. Jamal is a 32-year-old African-American man who constantly brags about being a cryptocurrency tech chief executive officer. His note read, "Sorry, Claire, but my high-profile investors will be there. Your cynical attitude just does not match our brand identity. But hey, make sure that $150,000 hold on the chateau clears by tomorrow morning." I sat there in the airport lounge staring at the glowing screen of my phone. I read the email 3 times to make sure I was not hallucinating. This was the man who drove leased luxury cars he could not actually afford. This was the sister who spent her days staging fake sponsored posts on social media to look important. And I was the sister who had been guilt-tripped by our parents, Richard and Susan, into securing the Chateau de Villette with my own corporate black card. My parents had begged me to do it. They said it would keep the family peace. They promised that Jamal was just waiting on a huge venture capital payout that would reimburse me the second they returned from their honeymoon. I had agreed against my better judgment simply because I was exhausted from always being painted as the unsupportive villain of the family. Most people would have broken down in tears right there in the terminal. Most people would have called their parents screaming, demanding an explanation or begging to be included. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel sad. Instead, I felt a sudden, crystal-clear sense of liberation. My profession requires me to identify bad investments and eliminate financial liabilities without hesitation. Right now, my family was the biggest liability of all. I closed the email application and opened my secure banking portal. I navigated to my active authorizations. There it was, a pending charge of $150,000 for a luxury French estate. I tapped the screen once to select the transaction. Then, with a calm smile on my face, I pressed Cancel Authorization. A small green checkmark appeared confirming the funds were pulled back. The reservation was officially void. I picked up my garment bag, walked out of the airport lounge, and hailed a cab back to my apartment in Manhattan. I poured myself a glass of red wine, turned my phone completely off, and went to sleep in my own bed. When the sun came up the next morning, I turned my phone back on. The screen completely froze. Notifications poured in like a digital avalanche, 99 missed calls. As I stared at the screen of my phone watching the notification counter, tick past 99 missed calls, I felt a profound sense of calm. There were 40 frantic text messages from my mother, a dozen from my father, and an endless stream of aggressive demands from Jamal. The average person might have panicked. They might have felt a twinge of guilt for leaving their own flesh and blood stranded at a luxury French estate with absolutely no way to pay the bill. But in my line of work, you do not panic when a bad investment fails. You simply cut your losses and move on. My sister and her fraudulent fiancé were the ultimate bad investment. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse apartment, looking out over the waking Manhattan skyline. The morning light hit the glass, taking my mind straight back to the crystal chandeliers in my parents' suburban dining room last Thanksgiving. That was the exact night the trap was set. We were all sitting around the heavy mahogany table. Jamal was holding court. He wore a velvet blazer and a watch that looked like a solid gold brick on his wrist. He spent 2 solid hours loudly bragging about his cryptocurrency startup, tossing around empty buzzwords about blockchain scalability and Series A funding. He claimed he had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal and was actively shopping for a massive compound in Calabasas. My sister Brittany sat next to him, beaming with smug superiority, acting as if she had personally discovered the next global tech billionaire. She spent the entire dinner making passive-aggressive comments about my boring corporate job, completely dismissing my career as a senior financial advisor. But the grand illusion shattered the moment the dinner plates were cleared. My father Richard pulled me into the kitchen, shutting the door tightly behind us. He looked incredibly nervous. He told me that Jamal needed a tiny, insignificant favor. The wedding venue in Paris, the historic Château de Villette, required a $150,000 deposit to secure the date. According to my father, Jamal had millions of dollars tied up in an offshore escrow account that would take a few weeks to clear. Richard looked me dead in the eye and told me it was my duty as the successful older sister to put the massive charge on my corporate black card. Just a temporary hold, he promised. He said it was necessary to keep the family peace. When I hesitated, my mother walked into the kitchen and immediately started the guilt trip. She said I was being incredibly selfish. She accused me of being jealous that Brittany had found a wealthy, successful man. She told me that if I did not do this one simple thing, I would ruin the most important day of my younger sister's life. So I did it. I gave them my card. I bought their temporary peace. But peace is a contract, and Brittany broke that contract the moment she banished me to be a Google Earth spectator. Standing in my quiet kitchen, I poured a cup of black coffee and let my analytical mind run the numbers. A credit authorization is not a cleared payment. It is a promise. By withdrawing my promise, the French venue manager would immediately demand payment via an international wire transfer. Jamal would inevitably try to stall, flexing his fake designer clothes and throwing around his imaginary tech credentials. But the French do not play games with high-end real estate. They would lock the iron gates. They would confiscate the designer luggage. The caterers would pack up the white truffles and the vintage champagne. The entire royal wedding facade would crumble into dust before the first guest even arrived. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, rich taste. I scrolled through the massive wall of text messages. My mother's texts shifted rapidly from confusion to absolute hysteria. Her last message read that the estate manager was threatening to call the local police, demanding I open my card right now. Jamal's messages were pure, unadulterated aggression. He threatened to destroy my career, claiming his wealthy investor friends were furious about the delay. Not a single text message asked how I was doing. Not one person asked why I was not on the plane. It was only ever about the money. The money they felt completely entitled to. The money they constantly used to prop up their golden child and her grifter of a fiancé. I set my coffee mug down on the cold marble counter. My phone screen finally unfroze, but the peaceful silence in my apartment did not last long. The device vibrated violently against the stone surface. The screen lit up with an incoming video call. Call number 100. It was my mother, and this time I was ready to answer. I pressed the green accept button on the screen. Immediately, the serene silence of my kitchen was shattered by a high-pitched shriek. My mother's face filled the frame, red and contorted with sheer panic. Behind her, I could clearly see the towering wrought iron gates of the Château de Villette. The gates were locked tight. Through the ornate metal bars, the sprawling French estate looked absolutely breathtaking with its perfectly manicured gardens and limestone facades. But my family was not inside enjoying the luxury. They were stranded on the gravel driveway outside, looking like a group of wealthy trespassers who had just been caught. Susan did not even bother to say hello. She launched right into a blistering attack. She screamed at the top of her lungs, accusing me of being a jealous, vindictive monster. She said I was completely sick in the head for trying to ruin Brittany's perfect day out of pure spite. To prove her point, she violently panned the camera around to show me the absolute disaster unfolding on the side of the country road. It was a scene of beautiful, poetic chaos. Brittany was sitting on a pile of vintage designer luggage, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Her carefully styled hair was already falling flat in the morning humidity. A few feet away, a delivery van from a high-end Parisian florist was backing up. Workers were actively loading massive arrangements of white hydrangeas and imported roses back into their truck. And then there was Jamal. He was pacing back and forth, furiously waving his arms and shouting at a very stern-looking Frenchman in a tailored gray suit. That man was clearly the estate manager, and he looked completely unimpressed by Jamal's aggressive posturing. My mother turned the camera back to her own furious face. She screamed that the estate manager had locked the entire wedding party out of the grounds. The man had just informed them that the $150,000 authorization was suddenly revoked. He was refusing to let the caterers inside to set up the champagne tower. He was demanding an immediate wire transfer to cover the entire cost of the venue, or he was going to call the local French authorities and report them for attempting to commit financial fraud. Susan was hyperventilating, wiping spit away from her mouth. She demanded to know how I could be so incredibly selfish. She said Brittany was absolutely devastated, her makeup was ruined, and the entire aesthetic of the wedding was destroyed because of my jealousy. I watched the panic on my phone screen as if I were watching a poorly written television drama. I felt absolutely no guilt. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked right at her. I told her that I was not being selfish at all. I was simply honoring Brittany's specific wishes. I reminded Susan that Brittany had explicitly stated in her email that my corporate energy was going to ruin her aesthetic. I told my mother that I figured my corporate credit card would carry that exact same negative energy, so I decided to keep it safely in New York. My mother gasped loudly, acting as if I had just slapped her across the face. She told me this was not the time for my sarcastic, cold-hearted games. She yelled that Jamal had very important venture capital investors arriving from London and Dubai in exactly 3 hours. She asked if I had any idea how embarrassing this was for him. She accused me of embarrassing our entire family on an international level. I kept my voice perfectly level. I pointed out that Jamal is a self-proclaimed cryptocurrency multimillionaire. I said that if he actually had high-profile investors arriving, he should have absolutely no problem handing the estate manager his own platinum card to cover the balance. I asked her why a tech chief executive officer needed the sister-in-law he just uninvited to foot the bill for his own wedding. Susan stammered. Her eyes darted away from the camera for a brief second. Deep down, she knew the truth. She knew Jamal did not have the cash. But her blind devotion to Brittany meant she would rather die than hold her golden child accountable. She screamed that his money was tied up in international crypto exchanges and took time to liquidate. She reminded me that I gave my word to handle the deposit to keep the family peace. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. I told her that my word was given under the condition that I was actually a guest at the wedding. You do not get to banish me from the venue and still expect me to finance the party. Susan shifted from panic to sheer authoritarian rage. She demanded that I open my banking app, call the fraud department, and authorize the charge immediately. She said she was my mother, and she was ordering me to fix this mess. I looked directly into the camera lens. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply said, "I am not on the guest list, Susan. My wallet is not either." The silence on the other end was deafening, but it only lasted for a fraction of a second. My mother's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She turned the camera toward Jamal, who was now marching toward her with murder in his eyes. Susan looked back at me, completely unhinged. She screamed that I was going to regret this because Jamal was getting his high-powered lawyers on the phone right now, and they were going to sue me for every penny I had for breach of contract. Before I could even respond to my mother's absurd threat about breach of contract, the camera violently jerked. The screen blurred for a second as the phone was yanked out of Susan's shaking hands. When the image stabilized, my father, Richard, was staring into the lens. He had completely bypassed the screaming phase. Instead, he deployed his favorite and most emotionally manipulative weapon, the disappointed dad routine. He let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking his head slowly, as if I were a rebellious teenager who had just missed curfew, rather than a 33-year-old financial executive who had finally set a boundary. Richard lowered his voice, trying to sound like the calm, rational patriarch, desperately trying to hold his broken family together. He told me to stop this nonsense right now. He said that I had made my point, and now it was time to act like an adult. He stared deeply into the camera and told me that I had always been selfish ever since I was a teenager. He launched into his favorite historical fiction, revising my entire childhood on the spot. He brought up the day I turned 18. He said I was cruel for packing my bags and moving away to New York City to chase my own greedy ambitions. He said I abandoned my family when they needed me most, and that I should have stayed home to help guide Brittany through her difficult transition into adulthood. According to Richard, my success was a direct result of my cold, unfeeling nature, and this stunt in Paris was just another example of me refusing to be a supportive sister. I listened to his entire speech without interrupting. I watched the fake sorrow in his eyes. For years, that specific tone of voice would have reduced me to a puddle of guilt. When I was younger, I used to bend over backwards trying to prove to him that I was a good daughter. I would buy them expensive gifts, pay for family vacations, and wire them money whenever they claimed things were tight, all just to chase a fleeting word of approval that never came. But today, sitting in my quiet, paid-off Manhattan apartment, his words held absolutely no power over me. I saw right through the manipulation. He did not want a daughter. He wanted a compliant, automated teller machine. I leaned closer to my phone, making sure he could see the absolute lack of sympathy on my face. I kept my voice dangerously quiet. "Help her?" I asked, repeating his ridiculous phrase. "You mean like how you drained my entire $40,000 college fund to pay for Brittany's high-priced defense lawyer when she got a driving under the influence charge at 19, Richard's jaw actually dropped. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. I did not give him a chance to recover. I pressed forward, laying out the cold, hard facts that we had conveniently ignored for over a decade. I reminded him that while he was lecturing me about family loyalty, I was the one who spent my entire early 20s eating instant noodles and working 3 jobs just to survive. I was forced to take out predatory student loans with astronomical interest rates just to finish my degree, all because he and Susan decided that keeping Brittany out of jail and hiding her reckless behavior from the neighborhood was more important than my education. I looked right at him and delivered the final blow. I paid my dues, Richard. I owe this family absolutely nothing. The color completely drained from his face. For the first time in my life, my father looked genuinely terrified of me. He was so used to me swallowing my pride to keep the peace that he had completely forgotten I possessed the exact same ruthless business acumen he always claimed to admire in other people. He looked down at the phone, opening his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a response that could somehow put me back in my place. He wanted to maintain his authority, but the moral high ground had completely collapsed beneath his feet. Before he could stammer out a single excuse, a large hand aggressively reached into the frame. Jamal snatched the phone right out of my father's grip. The camera shook violently again before focusing tightly on Jamal's face. His eyes were wide with a toxic, unhinged arrogance. The fake, charming smile he usually wore was completely gone, replaced by a vicious sneer. He brought the phone so close to his face that I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. He pointed a finger directly at the camera, and lowered his voice into a menacing whisper. He told me that I had just made the biggest mistake of my entire life and that he was going to make sure I lost absolutely everything. Jamal held the phone so tightly I thought the screen might crack under his grip. He was attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me through the camera lens, puffing out his chest under his custom-tailored suit jacket. He lowered his voice, adopting the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who was used to talking his way out of empty promises. He told me that I was acting like a hysterical, jealous woman and that I had absolutely no idea who I was messing with. He claimed that his venture capital investors were currently on a private jet descending into Paris at this exact moment. According to Jamal, these were heavy hitters from Silicon Valley and international royalty who expected a certain level of luxury. He said that by throwing this little temper tantrum, I was not just ruining a wedding, I was jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar corporate merger. He did not stop there. He decided to take a direct shot at my livelihood. Jamal sneered into the camera and confidently stated that he played golf with the senior partners at my financial firm. He threatened that if I did not immediately call my bank and reinstate the $150,000 authorization, he would make one phone call and have me completely blacklisted from the financial sector. He promised that by the end of the business day, I would be unemployed, disgraced, and begging my parents for a loan just to pay my rent. He finished his unhinged monologue by demanding that I apologize to him, apologize to Brittany, and fix the credit card issue within the next 5 minutes. I sat perfectly still and let him exhaust himself. In my line of work, the worst thing you can do during a negotiation is interrupt a desperate man who is currently digging his own grave. I analyzed every single micro-expression on his face. I noticed the thick bead of sweat rolling down his temple. I saw the slight uncontrollable tremor in the hand holding the phone. I registered the frantic shifting of his eyes. These were not the confident mannerisms of a powerful tech executive. These were the textbook physical reactions of a cornered scammer who knew his house of cards was about to collapse. When he finally stopped speaking, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the digital space between us. I took a deep breath and looked right into his panicked eyes. I kept my tone completely flat and conversational, stripping away any trace of the emotional reaction he was desperately hoping to provoke. I told him that it was fascinating that he played golf with my senior partners, considering my firm explicitly prohibited its executives from engaging with unregulated cryptocurrency startups. I also pointed out that truly wealthy individuals do not usually threaten their future sister-in-law over a venue deposit. Then I delivered the single undeniable truth that he had been dodging since the day he met my sister. I leaned closer to the screen and said, "Jamal, if you are as incredibly rich as you claim to be, if you truly have millions of dollars sitting in offshore accounts and high-profile investors begging to throw capital at you, then this should not be a crisis. Pull your wallet out of your designer jacket, take out your own American Express card, walk up to the estate manager, and swipe it for the $150,000 yourself." The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. Dead silence. The arrogant sneer vanished completely from his face, replaced by a hollow, terrified stare. He opened his mouth, but his silver tongue completely failed him. No words came out. There was no clever comeback, no aggressive counterattack, no business jargon to hide behind. He was entirely paralyzed. In the background, I could see my mother covering her mouth in horror, and Brittany staring at Jamal, waiting for him to confidently produce the black card he had always bragged about. But his hands remained frozen at his sides. The illusion was dead. I did not wait for his pathetic excuses. I did not need to hear him stammer about daily spending limits or international wire delays. The absolute silence was the only confirmation I needed. I reached forward and calmly pressed the red button to end the call. The screen went black, and my kitchen was instantly restored to its peaceful, quiet state. I set the phone face down on the marble counter. I felt a profound sense of closure. The toxic cord tying me to their endless demands had finally been cut. I walked over to the refrigerator, poured myself a glass of cold water, and started to prepare a simple breakfast. For the first time in my life, I was not scrambling to solve my family's self-inflicted disasters. Exactly 10 minutes passed. I was just sitting down at my kitchen island when a sharp, distinct chime echoed through the room. It was not a text message or a missed call. It was a high-priority push notification from the professional public relations monitoring software I use to track media coverage for my corporate clients. I had set up an alert for my own name months ago, purely as a precaution. I picked up my tablet. The screen flashed bright red with an urgent update. Brittany had just gone live on social media to her thousands of followers. I tapped the flashing red link on my tablet. The screen immediately populated with a video from TikTok. There was my sister Brittany sitting at a picturesque outdoor cafe in Paris. A perfectly untouched cappuccino sat on the small circular table in front of her. The Eiffel Tower was visibly blurred in the background, providing the perfect tragic cinematic setting. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses, pushing them up to wipe away completely fabricated tears. She had perfectly mastered the art of the internet victim video. She looked directly into the camera, her lower lip trembling flawlessly, and started to weave the most spectacular web of lies I had ever heard. Brittany told her audience that her fairy tale dream wedding had just been maliciously destroyed hours before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. She sniffled softly, claiming that her wealthy corporate older sister had intentionally canceled the luxury venue out of pure spite, stranding them in a foreign country. But she did not stop at simply calling me a jealous or narcissistic sibling. She went straight for the nuclear option. Brittany lowered her voice, attempting to sound profoundly traumatized, and told her thousands of followers that I had always harbored deep resentment toward Jamal. She explicitly stated to the internet that I canceled the venue because I was a deeply racist individual who simply could not stand the fact that she was marrying a brilliant African-American man who was infinitely more successful than me. She painted Jamal as a self-made tech genius who was now desperately scrambling to save their special day while dealing with my blatant bigotry. She even pulled out her phone and showed the camera a printed screenshot of the cancellation notice, conveniently cropping out the part where my name was on the credit card authorization. She begged her followers to send positive energy, claiming they were currently stranded on the streets of Paris with nowhere to go. I watched the viewer count in the top corner of the screen absolutely skyrocket. The algorithm had picked it up. It went from 5,000 viewers to 50,000 and then crossed the 100,000 mark in a matter of minutes. The comments section was a rapid blur of absolute outrage. People were tagging my name, searching for my digital footprint, and demanding to know where I worked. The internet loves a clear-cut villain, and Brittany had just served them one on a silver platter seasoned with highly inflammatory buzzwords. Within 30 minutes of the video being posted, the digital mob had successfully crossed over from TikTok to my professional platforms. My phone started vibrating so constantly it felt warm to the touch. My LinkedIn profile, which I meticulously maintained for high-level corporate networking and client acquisition, was suddenly under a massive coordinated siege. Hundreds of direct messages and public comments began flooding my notifications. Complete strangers were leaving unhinged comments on my old professional posts, calling me a corporate racist, a bitter monster, and a toxic elite. They began organizing a digital campaign demanding that my financial firm terminate my employment immediately. They were finding my company's public page and leaving dozens of one-star reviews citing my name directly and accusing my firm of employing a discriminatory executive. My tablet chimed again, piercing through the constant buzzing of my phone. This time, it was not a social media alert. It was a high-priority encrypted notification from my secure work email. I opened my professional inbox. The sender was the executive director of human resources at my financial firm. The email was marked with high importance. The subject line read, "Urgent review regarding social media allegations and corporate reputation." The body of the email was brief and formal, requesting my immediate presence in a mandatory virtual meeting with the senior partners and the legal team to discuss a highly sensitive public relations crisis involving my name. For an executive in the wealth management and risk assessment sector, an email like this is usually a career death sentence. Financial firms do not hesitate to cut ties with massive liabilities, especially when words like racism and financial sabotage are trending on social media right next to their corporate logo. Most people in my position would have been hyperventilating. They would have been furiously typing out a desperate public apology or calling their parents crying and begging their family to take the video down before their entire livelihood was destroyed. But I did not panic. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or regret. I locked my tablet, leaned back in my leather chair, and took a long, deep breath. A genuine, entirely relaxed smile spread across my face. By taking this private family dispute and turning it into a public defamatory spectacle, Jamal and Brittany had just given me the legal and professional clearance to absolutely destroy them. This is exactly the mistake I wanted them to make. I closed the public relations monitoring application on my tablet and opened my secure corporate laptop. I adjusted the camera angle, smoothed out the collar of my silk blouse, and clicked the encrypted link to join the mandatory virtual meeting. The screen instantly populated with two high-definition video feeds. On the left was the Executive Director of Human Resources, looking incredibly stern with a thick physical folder resting on her desk. On the right was the Senior Managing Partner of our entire wealth management division, Mr. Preston. He was a ruthless, seasoned financial veteran who did not tolerate corporate liabilities of any kind. The digital room was completely silent for a few seconds. Mr. Preston leaned forward, folding his hands together. He did not bother with any polite small talk. He immediately stated that the firm was currently experiencing a massive influx of negative public attention. He noted that my sister had essentially accused me of racial discrimination and financial sabotage in front of millions of people. The HR director chimed in, adding that our legal team was deeply concerned about the optics of an executive at a top-tier wealth management firm being publicly branded as a malicious bigot. They asked me to explain the situation immediately, fully expecting me to be tearful, defensive, and desperate to save my career. I did not offer a single apology. I did not get emotional or attempt to defend my personal character against my sister's outrageous claims. Instead, I looked directly into the camera and told Mr. Preston that this was not a family dispute. I stated clearly that this was an active risk management exercise, and I had just successfully prevented our firm from becoming entangled in a federal financial crime. Before either of them could process that statement, I clicked the green button at the bottom of my screen and initiated a screen share. I bypassed the video of Brittany crying in Paris entirely. Instead, I pulled up a highly detailed 50-page investigative dossier I had been quietly building over the last 6 months. I directed their attention to the screen. I started with the basics. I showed them the public registration documents for Jamal's supposed cryptocurrency technology startup. I highlighted the corporate address, which I had cross-referenced, to prove it was nothing more than a mailbox at a local shipping store in a strip mall. I showed them the vehicle identification numbers for the luxury sports cars Jamal constantly flaunted on social media, proving they were all short-term daily rentals under a different name. The HR director looked visibly confused, but Mr. Preston was absolutely glued to the screen. His eyes darted across the documents as I pulled up the most critical piece of evidence. I displayed a certified copy of active court records from the state of Nevada. I explained that my future brother-in-law was not a chief executive officer. He was currently the primary defendant in an ongoing federal investigation for wire fraud and cryptocurrency embezzlement. His personal assets had been entirely frozen by the authorities 3 weeks ago. I kept my voice sharp and professional as I explained my specific actions at the airport. I told my bosses that Jamal had intentionally manipulated my family into using my corporate black card to fund a $150,000 international transaction. If I had allowed that authorization to clear, our firm would have been directly financing the lavish lifestyle of an active federal fraud suspect. It would have triggered an automatic anti-money laundering investigation into our own corporate accounts. I looked at the senior partner and told him I canceled the venue strictly as a compliance measure to protect the firm's assets and reputation. I added that Brittany's viral video was simply a desperate retaliation from a con artist who had just lost his funding. The hostility in the virtual room vanished completely. The HR director slowly closed her physical folder, her jaw slightly open. Mr. Preston leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, calculated smile spreading across his face. He was no longer looking at me as a potential public relations nightmare. He was looking at me like the sharpest weapon in his entire corporate arsenal. Mr. Preston asked me to scroll back up to the first page of the dossier. He told me to read the exact legal name of Jamal's shell company out loud. I read the name off the screen. Mr. Preston chuckled darkly. He shook his head and revealed a piece of information that made the entire situation fall perfectly into place. He told me that our private equity division had recently purchased a massive portfolio of high-risk distressed debt from a failing credit union. He explained that one of the worst-performing loans in that entire package was tied directly to Jamal's fraudulent company. Jamal did not just owe the federal government money, he owed our firm money, and his debt was currently being managed by our subsidiary collection agency, Apex Capital. Mr. Preston looked right into the camera, the corporate shark inside him fully awakened. He told me that human resources would officially ignore the noise on social media. He then gave me his absolute blessing to handle the situation however I saw fit. He smiled and told me to collect our money, giving me the green light to destroy Jamal's financial life completely. I closed my laptop and disconnected from the virtual meeting with Mr. Preston. The silence in my apartment felt completely different now. It was no longer just the quiet sanctuary of a woman who had cut off her toxic family. It was a war room. I did not just have my own personal vindication. I had the full unchecked backing of a multi-billion-dollar Wall Street institution. My firm had officially given me the green light to clear my name and collect their debt. I walked over to my kitchen island and picked up my personal tablet. Brittany had chosen the battlefield when she posted that crying video on social media. She wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to leverage her followers to destroy my professional reputation. But she made a massive tactical error. She brought a fabricated emotional narrative to a fight against a woman who specialized in forensic financial destruction. Most people in my position would have felt the overwhelming urge to defend themselves on camera. They would have set up a ring light hit record and cried about how unfairly they were being treated. They would have posted a 10-minute video explaining their side of the story, desperately trying to win over the court of public opinion with emotion. I did not do any of that. I refused to play her game. Emotion is sloppy. Facts are lethal. I opened my professional LinkedIn network and my public Twitter account. I decided to make a single, perfectly sterile text post. No videos, no selfies, no long-winded paragraphs about my childhood trauma or how much it hurt to be excluded from the wedding. I approached the social media post exactly like I would approach a corporate audit. First, I directly tagged Brittany's heavily curated influencer handle. Next, I tagged Jamal's supposed technology startup account, the one he used to constantly brag about his non-existent venture capital funding. Then I began to upload the attachments. I did not upload text messages or family photos. I uploaded high-resolution, unedited screenshots of the public court documents from my investigative dossier. The first image was the official federal docket from the state of Nevada. The federal seal was clearly visible at the top of the page. Right below it, Jamal was listed as the primary defendant in a massive, ongoing criminal lawsuit. The second image was a highlighted section of the indictment detailing the specific charges of federal wire fraud and cryptocurrency embezzlement. It explicitly outlined how he had defrauded dozens of small investors out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The third image was the most damning of all. It was a signed federal court order dated just 3 weeks prior, officially freezing all of Jamal's personal and business banking assets, pending a criminal trial. I made sure every single piece of information was a matter of public record. In the United States, truth is an absolute defense against defamation. You cannot be sued for slander or libel if you are simply posting verified court documents. Jamal had tried to paint me as a jealous racist sister who canceled his wedding out of pure spite. I was about to show the entire world that he was just a desperate broke con artist who needed my corporate black card because the federal government had completely frozen his stolen funds. I looked at the blank text box above the attachments. I did not need to write a thesis. The federal documents spoke entirely for themselves. I kept my statement incredibly brief, coldly professional, and devastatingly clear. I typed out the words with steady fingers, knowing this single sentence was going to systematically dismantle the fake reality they had spent years building. I reviewed the post one last time. The tags were active. The court documents were crystal clear. The trap was fully set. I did not feel a shred of pity for my sister or the man she chose to align herself with. They had demanded my money, excluded me from the celebration, and then tried to ruin my career when I refused to be their compliant victim. I pressed my finger against the screen and hit publish, sending the post out to the millions of people who were currently refreshing my name on the internet. My caption read, "The venue was cancelled because I do not launder money for fraudsters. Enjoy the live stream." The moment my post went live across my social media platforms, the digital atmosphere completely shifted. It took exactly 4 minutes for the internet to connect the dots. The algorithm, which had previously been pushing Britney's tearful victim video to millions of users, suddenly caught wind of my response. The traffic violently reversed direction. I sat back and watched the engagement metrics on my screen tick upward at a blinding speed. People were capturing screenshots of my federal court document attachments and cross-posting them directly into the comment section of Britney's viral video. The tide of public opinion turned with terrifying efficiency. The hundreds of people who had been aggressively demanding my corporate termination just moments ago were now flooding Britney's page with a completely different kind of outrage. They realized they had been weaponized by a fraudster. I watched in real time as my sister desperately tried to regain control of her carefully curated image. She began frantically deleting the top comments exposing Jamal. But the internet is a relentless machine, and she simply could not keep up. For every single comment she managed to delete, 10 more appeared in its place. People were demanding an explanation. They were asking why her brilliant tech executive fiancé was currently under a federal asset freeze. Then the true internet sleuths arrived. There is nothing more dangerous to a con artist than a group of highly motivated, incredibly bored people on the internet with a solid wireless connection. They took the breadcrumbs I provided and escalated the investigation to a completely new level. Within 30 minutes, a massive viral thread began trending on multiple platforms. Users had pulled the metadata from Jamal's most popular social media posts. They zoomed in on the license plates of the 3 different luxury sports cars he constantly posed in front of. They ran the plates and posted the undeniable proof that every single vehicle was registered to an hourly exotic car rental service down in Miami. Another group of users took the corporate address I provided in my screenshots and went straight to a digital street view. They posted the image of his supposed multi-million-dollar technology headquarters. It was not a sleek glass office building in Silicon Valley. It was a dusty shipping and receiving store sandwiched between a discount nail salon and a fast food restaurant in a crumbling strip mall. The illusion was being systematically ripped apart brick by brick for the entire world to witness. The fallout was not just digital. It began bleeding into the real world, specifically halfway across the globe in Paris. The so-called venture capital investors that Jamal had bragged about were not high-level executives at all. They were low-level victims of his cryptocurrency scheme who had flown to France under the false promise of receiving their massive financial payout during the wedding weekend. Because of the viral nature of the drama, these guests started seeing the exposure posts while standing right outside the locked gates of the Château de Villette. A new video surfaced online, filmed by a random bystander. It showed several angry guests cornering Jamal on the gravel driveway, screaming at him and demanding their money back. Jamal was visibly sweating, backing away from the crowd with his hands up, while my parents stood paralyzed in the background, looking absolutely horrified. Britney finally gave up on trying to delete the comments. She completely deactivated all of her social media accounts, disappearing from the internet entirely. The silence that followed her deletion was incredibly satisfying. She had tried to leverage her digital audience to destroy my actual physical life. Instead, her own audience had completely eradicated her digital existence. I closed my social media applications and took a quiet sip of my coffee. The air in my apartment felt so much lighter. I had successfully defended my career, protected my firm, and exposed a dangerous fraudster without ever having to raise my voice or shed a single tear. The narrative was entirely back under my control. I assumed the chaotic drama in France would slowly burn itself out, as my family realized they had no choice but to pack their bags and fly home to America in absolute disgrace. But Jamal was not just a liar. He was deeply arrogant and incredibly stupid. My phone vibrated sharply on the marble counter. It was not a social media notification. It was a direct text message from an international number. I recognized the country code immediately. It was the estate manager from the Chateau de Villette. I opened the message expecting a final confirmation of the cancelled reservation. Instead, the text sent a chill down my spine. The manager wrote, "Miss Claire, I wanted to inform you that I have just contacted the local police. The man claiming to be your brother-in-law just attempted to pay the $150,000 balance using a stolen credit card. They are not letting him leave the premises." I stared at the text message from the estate manager. Jamal had actually tried to swipe a stolen credit card in front of French authorities. The sheer arrogance of the man was only matched by his profound stupidity. I typed a quick, polite reply to the manager, thanking him for the update, and confirming once again that I had absolutely no legal or financial ties to Jamal or his associates. I locked my phone and set it down on the counter. The wedding was officially dead. There would be no romantic vows exchanged under the Parisian sun, no expensive champagne towers, and no perfectly curated social media photos to flaunt online. The grand illusion was entirely shattered. Through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances who had unfortunately paid their own way to France, I received piecemeal updates over the next 24 hours about the absolute disaster unfolding across the Atlantic. Once the French police arrived at the Chateau de Villette, the remaining guests completely panicked. They quickly realized they were caught in the middle of an active criminal investigation involving an exposed fraudster. The so-called venture capitalists and tech investors who had flown in to celebrate with Jamal scattered like roaches when the lights turn on. They ordered private cars and fled directly to the airport, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive mess. But escaping was not that easy for the bride and groom. Jamal and Brittany managed to avoid immediate jail time at the venue only because the stolen credit card was flagged before the transaction could clear, and the estate manager simply wanted them off his pristine property. But their problems were far from over. When they finally made it to Charles de Gaulle Airport, attempting to quietly flee the country, they were detained right at the terminal. It turned out that Jamal had also tried to use fraudulent funds to book their luxury hotel suites in central Paris. The hotel management had already flagged their passports. They were pulled aside by airport security and held in a small windowless room for hours. They were relentlessly interrogated by French customs and local authorities about their massive unpaid bills. My sister, who had spent the last year bragging about her elevated status and her wealthy fiancé, was now sitting in a cold airport holding room crying over her ruined aesthetic while facing international theft charges. They desperately needed a financial bailout, since the federal government had frozen Jamal's stolen cryptocurrency funds and I had firmly shut my wallet. The burden fell entirely on my parents. Richard and Susan were suddenly thrust into a waking nightmare. They had spent their entire lives treating my sister like absolute royalty, constantly shielding her from any real-world consequences. Now the consequences had arrived with a staggering price tag. To keep Brittany and Jamal from being formally arrested and thrown into a French prison, my father had to empty whatever was left of his personal checking account to settle the hotel debt on the spot. But that massive payment left them with absolutely no money for flights home. Jamal's original first-class return tickets had been booked through a fraudulent travel agency account that was now completely locked by the authorities. My parents were completely stranded in a foreign country. They had no choice but to pull out their wallets and max out their last 2 remaining credit cards just to buy 4 economy-class tickets back to the United States. I could only imagine the sheer humiliation Richard and Susan felt, sitting violently cramped in coach for 8 agonizing hours. They had to listen to Brittany sob uncontrollably the entire flight, while Jamal nervously checked his phone, knowing federal agents were highly likely waiting for him back on American soil. My parents had traded their dignity, their life savings, and their entire reputation to protect a golden child who had led them straight off a cliff. 2 full days passed. The viral storm on the internet had finally settled into a low hum of constant mockery, directed at my sister's deleted accounts. I had returned to my regular work schedule, reviewing risk portfolios and closing deals from the comfort of my home office. I assumed my family was hiding back in their quiet suburban house, licking their wounds, and figuring out how to pay off the massive debt they had just incurred. I severely underestimated their delusion and their audacity. They were not hiding in the suburbs, they were looking for a scapegoat to blame for their own catastrophic failures. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly earnings report when my cell phone chimed brightly. It was a direct text message from the front desk of my Manhattan high-rise building. I opened the message. The concierge, a very professional man who rarely ever broke security protocol, had sent me an urgent text. It read, "Miss Claire, your parents are in the lobby. They are extremely agitated and demanding to come up." I stared at the text message from my building concierge, the glowing words completely contrasting the quiet serenity of my apartment. The logical safest response would have been to instruct security to escort them off the premises immediately. I had every legal right to leave them standing on the sidewalk in the middle of Manhattan, locked out of my life forever. But I did not type that response. I realized that if I turned them away now, they would simply fester. They would retreat to the suburbs and continue to view themselves as the ultimate victims of my supposed cruelty. I wanted to look them in the eye. I wanted this final confrontation to happen entirely on my territory, surrounded by the undeniable proof of the success they had spent my entire life trying to belittle. I typed a brief reply to the front desk, instructing the concierge to grant them access to the private security elevator that led directly to my penthouse. The elevator ride from the lobby to the top floor takes exactly 45 seconds. I used that brief window of time to prepare myself. I poured the rest of my coffee down the kitchen sink and walked out to the expansive marble foyer. I stood perfectly straight in the center of the room. I was wearing a sharply tailored silk blouse and designer trousers projecting the exact corporate energy my sister had claimed to despise so much. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the expensive artwork on my walls. I was entirely in my element. The soft melodic chime of the private elevator echoed through the quiet apartment, signaling their arrival. The heavy brushed steel doors slid apart, revealing a portrait of absolute utter defeat. The visual contrast between my pristine living space and the four people standing inside the elevator car was almost comical. My sister Brittany, who usually spent 3 hours a day meticulously perfecting her makeup for social media, looked completely unrecognizable. She was wearing oversized, deeply wrinkled gray sweatpants. Her artificial tan was streaked from days of crying, and dark, heavy circles dragged down the corners of her eyes. She clutched a cheap neck pillow from the economy flight as if it were a physical lifeline. Standing right next to her was Jamal, the arrogant, slick-talking tech billionaire who had threatened to destroy my career just 2 days ago was entirely gone. He looked intensely paranoid, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically around my secure foyer like he expected federal agents to jump out from behind my indoor plants at any second. He was wearing the same dress shirt he had worn at the French estate, now deeply stained and reeking of stale airplane air. And then there were my parents. Richard and Susan stepped out of the elevator first. They appeared to have aged 10 years in the span of 72 hours. Their shoulders were slumped, completely weighed down by the massive financial disaster they had willingly walked directly into, but the sheer exhaustion on their faces was quickly overshadowed by a burning, irrational hatred. They marched right into my home, the wheels of their scuffed luggage dragging loudly across my imported hardwood floors. Richard did not even take a moment to absorb his luxurious surroundings. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and immediately started shouting. His voice echoed harshly off the high ceilings as he accused me of orchestrating a malicious smear campaign to destroy their lives. He yelled that they had been treated like common street criminals by the French authorities at the airport. He screamed that he had been forced to drain his absolute last line of credit just to buy the family economy tickets to escape the country. He demanded to know what was wrong with me, acting as though my refusal to fund a federal fugitive was a direct betrayal of the family name. Brittany stepped out from behind Jamal, her voice a shrill, hysterical whine. She accused me of intentionally ruining her fairy tale life. She pointed at her wrinkled clothes and sobbed that she had to sit next to the bathrooms and coach for 8 agonizing hours, while the entire internet publicly laughed at her downfall. She demanded that I hand over my phone right then and there to publicly retract the statements I made online. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match their chaotic, desperate volume. I simply stood there, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, observing them with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a failed experiment. I looked at my father and calmly stated that nobody forced him to give his credit card to a con artist. I told Brittany that the internet was laughing at her because she chose to marry a criminal, not because of anything I did. My complete lack of sympathy and refusal to accept their blame was the final breaking point for my mother. Susan had always been the primary enforcer of the family delusion. Hearing me speak the blunt, unfiltered truth shattered whatever tiny shred of emotional restraint she had left. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She let out a guttural scream blaming me for their financial ruin and their international humiliation. Without a single second of hesitation, Susan lunged aggressively across the marble floor. She raised her right hand high into the air, putting the entire weight of her body into a vicious swing aimed directly at my face. But I had spent my entire life anticipating their attacks. I did not step back. I reached out and caught her wrist firmly in mid-air. I held my mother's wrist in a vice grip suspended in the space between us. The sheer shock on her face was almost comical. For my entire life, she had been the untouchable matriarch, dealing out emotional and verbal abuse with absolute impunity. She expected me to cower to take the physical blow, just like I had always taken the emotional ones. But I am not that scared little girl anymore. I looked directly into her wide, furious eyes, letting the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, I shoved her hand away. I did not push her hard enough to make her fall, but the physical rejection was enough to make her stumble backward into my father's chest. Susan grabbed her own wrist, her chest heaving as she stared at me in total disbelief. When the physical assault failed, she immediately reverted to her primary weapon. She opened her mouth and let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She shrieked that I was a deeply sick, vindictive monster who had just systematically destroyed our family's pristine reputation. She pointed a shaking finger at Brittany, who was currently whimpering on my expensive Italian leather sofa, and wailed that I had completely ruined my younger sister's entire life. According to Susan, Brittany could never show her face in their affluent suburban neighborhood ever again. The country club women were already gossiping, the neighbors were laughing at them, and it was all my fault because I refused to be a team player and pay for a simple wedding venue. She screamed that my social media post was a calculated act of pure evil meant to publicly humiliate them in front of the entire world. I stood my ground completely unfazed by her theatrical meltdown. I opened my mouth to remind her that Jamal's federal indictment was the actual cause of their humiliation, but before I could speak a single word, Richard stepped directly in front of his wife. He put a hand on Susan's shoulder, silencing her, and puffed out his chest. He was trying to project the intimidating aura of a powerful businessman, which was incredibly difficult to do, while standing in his daughter's multi-million-dollar penthouse after just flying economy class on maxed-out credit cards. Richard looked me up and down with utter disgust. He dropped the emotional guilt trip entirely and pivoted straight to business. He coldly stated that my little digital stunt had caused catastrophic financial damages to their family unit. He claimed that because I maliciously posted private legal documents online, Jamal's high-profile technology investors had completely pulled out of their multi-million-dollar backing. He kept using the word defamation, clearly having no understanding of how the law actually works. He declared that my actions were completely illegal and that I was personally responsible for the collapse of Jamal's imaginary corporate empire. Then Richard delivered an ultimatum so profoundly delusional that I actually had to stop myself from laughing out loud. He crossed his arms over his wrinkled shirt and demanded that I walk over to my desk, take out my checkbook, and write them a cashier's check for exactly $200,000, immediately. He stood in the center of my living room and seriously tried to extort me. He broke down the completely fabricated invoice for me. He said the $200,000 would cover the outrageous last-minute flights from Paris, the hotel bills I supposedly forced them to incur, the severe emotional distress I caused Brittany, and the immediate replacement of Jamal's lost venture capital. Richard leaned forward, his face turning an angry shade of red, and lowered his voice into a threatening growl. He promised me that if I did not hand over a check for $200,000 right this second, he was going to hire the most ruthless, aggressive civil litigation lawyers in the state of New York. He swore he would drag my name through the mud, sue me for every single penny I had ever earned, and subpoena my financial firm until I was fired and left with absolutely nothing. The absolute audacity of the demand was breathtaking. They had brought a con artist into the family, drained their own accounts to fund his lies, and now they were attempting to rob me to cover their massive losses. As my father continued to aggressively outline his imaginary lawsuit, I noticed a shift in the dynamic of the room. Jamal, who had been completely silent and terrified since stepping off the elevator, suddenly found his courage. Seeing my parents fiercely defend his honor and demand money on his behalf gave him a renewed sense of arrogant confidence. He slowly stepped out from the hallway, moving to stand directly behind my father's right shoulder. He felt perfectly safe using my parents as a human shield. The paranoid look in his eyes vanished, replaced by that same toxic, smug smirk he had worn at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Jamal tilted his head, looked me dead in the eye, and whispered in a low, mocking tone, "You messed with the wrong family, Claire." I stared at Jamal as his whispered threat hung in the air. "You messed with the wrong family, Claire." The sheer absurdity of that statement, coming from a man wearing a deeply stained dress shirt, hiding behind my parents like a frightened child, was simply too much. I did not glare at him. I did not offer a sharp retort. Instead, a genuine, completely unforced laugh escaped my lips. The sound echoed brightly across the high ceilings of my penthouse, cutting through the thick, tense atmosphere of the room. I turned my back on all four of them, completely dismissing their aggressive posturing. I walked casually over to the custom wet bar built into the far wall of my living room. I opened the small glass refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of imported sparkling water, and twisted the cap off. The sharp hiss of the carbonation was the only sound in the apartment. I poured the water over a glass of ice, added a fresh slice of lime, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I turned back around to face my furious family leaning comfortably against the marble counter. I looked at my father, who was still red in the face from his ridiculous extortion demand, and decided it was time to give him a free legal consultation. I kept my voice perfectly conversational, the exact tone I use when explaining basic financial concepts to novice interns at my firm. I told Richard that we needed to unpack this grand lawsuit he was currently planning. I explained that in the state of New York, a successful defamation lawsuit requires the plaintiff to prove that a false statement of fact was published causing reputational or financial injury. I heavily emphasized the word false. I took another sip of my sparkling water and pointed directly at Jamal. I stated that under New York civil rights law, the publication of a fair and true report of any judicial proceeding is entirely privileged. You simply cannot sue someone for sharing active federal court documents. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. I smiled coldly at the fake billionaire. I told Jamal that since he was currently under a federal indictment for wire fraud and his assets were officially frozen by the United States government, the only legal counsel he should be speaking to right now is a federal public defender. I added that the idea of a broke, indicted fraudster hiring high-powered civil litigators to sue a wealth management executive for sharing public records was nothing short of a pathetic comedy routine. Jamal opened his mouth to speak, but the confident swagger was completely gone. No words came out. He looked down at the hardwood floor, his jaw tight, entirely unable to contradict the legal reality of his situation. I set my glass down on the counter. The ice clinked sharply, a final punctuation mark to my legal breakdown. I shifted my gaze away from Jamal and focused entirely on my parents. This was the part of the equation that truly fascinated me. I looked at Richard and Susan, taking in their exhausted, defeated postures. I asked them a very simple, incredibly logical question. Why on earth are you fighting this hard for him? I gestured toward Jamal, outlining the devastating reality they were desperately trying to ignore. I reminded my parents that this man had lied to them since the day he walked into their house. He did not have a revolutionary technology startup. He did not have venture capital investors flying around the world on private jets. He was a textbook con artist who scammed vulnerable people out of their life savings and used that stolen cash to lease luxury cars so he could pretend he belonged in our tax bracket. I took a step closer to my father, dropping the conversational tone. My voice became a sharp, cutting edge. I told Richard that Jamal was the direct reason they had been humiliated and detained by French authorities. He was the reason my parents had to max out their credit cards to escape a foreign country. He was the reason their golden child was currently sitting on my sofa in cheap sweatpants crying over a shattered illusion instead of sipping champagne on a honeymoon. Yet despite all of this undeniable proof, they had marched into my home to demand I pay them $200,000 to replace his supposed lost capital. I asked my father why he was so blindly determined to protect a criminal who had brought nothing but absolute ruin to our family name. Richard's face contorted violently. The prominent vein in his neck throbbed against his collar. He was entirely trapped between his desperate need to maintain his patriarchal authority and the crushing, humiliating reality of his own colossal failure. I kept pushing him, demanding to know what kind of spell this grifter had cast over them to make them abandon all logic and reason. My father clenched his fists tightly at his sides. His chest heaved as he desperately searched his mind for a valid argument to put me back in my place. Finally, the immense pressure of his secret became entirely too much to bear. The proud, authoritative facade violently cracked in two. He took a heavy step forward, his eyes wide and completely unhinged, and yelled at the top of his lungs. "Because we gave him the money, Claire. We gave him $200,000 to invest." The words echoed loudly across the quiet expanse of my living room. I stopped moving entirely. The glass of sparkling water halted halfway to my mouth. I slowly lowered the glass back down onto the cool marble counter, never taking my eyes off my father's red, sweating face. I repeated the number very slowly, letting the massive figure hang heavily in the air between us. $200,000. I knew exactly what my parents' financial portfolio looked like. I had personally audited their retirement accounts 3 years ago when they asked me for financial planning advice. Advice they ultimately ignored because they thought my investment strategies were too conservative. I knew for a fact that they did not have $200,000 in liquid cash just sitting in a checking account. They did not have it in stocks, and they certainly did not have it in bonds. I took a deliberate step away from the wet bar, closing the physical distance between us. The detached, cynical amusement I felt just moments ago completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, surgical focus. I looked directly at Richard and asked him a very specific, highly targeted question. I asked him exactly where he got that kind of capital. My mother suddenly looked absolutely terrified. She dropped her gaze to the hardwood floor, refusing to make eye contact with me. Over on the sofa, Brittany stopped crying and nervously began picking at the frayed sleeves of her cheap sweatpants, clearly aware of the catastrophic secret that was about to be exposed. Richard swallowed hard. The arrogant, demanding posture of the intimidating patriarch was completely gone. He tried to mumble an incoherent excuse about liquidating some old assets and moving some things around, but I cut him off immediately. I raised my voice just enough to command the room and demanded the absolute truth. My father's shoulders slumped forward. He looked like a defeated man who was finally reading the punishing terms and conditions of a contract he had already blindly signed. He confessed, his voice trembling and barely above a whisper, that they had taken out a home equity line of credit. A HELOC. They had gone to a private lender and leveraged their 4-bedroom suburban house. The exact same house they had spent the last 30 years of their lives painstakingly paying off. It was their single largest financial asset, the absolute cornerstone of their entire retirement plan, their only real safety net. And they had signed it all away to borrow cold hard cash. I stared at them in absolute horrifying disbelief. I asked my father to clarify the timeline of this massive financial blunder. Richard quietly admitted that they finalized the loan paperwork 2 months ago. Jamal had pulled them aside one evening and convinced them that the cryptocurrency market was about to experience a massive, unprecedented bull run. He fed them a ridiculous, convoluted lie, claiming he had exclusive insider information on a revolutionary new blockchain protocol that was guaranteed to skyrocket. Jamal promised my aging parents that if they simply handed over the equity of their home to him, he would easily double their money in 6 short weeks, right before the wedding in Paris. He painted a picture of absolute luxury, telling them they would have enough cash to pay off the extravagant ceremony, retire comfortably 10 years early, and even buy a vacation home down in Florida. It was a textbook low-level Ponzi scheme pitch, and my parents, blinded by their desperate need to elevate their golden child into high society, had swallowed it whole. I slowly turned my gaze from my broken father to the man standing right behind him. For the very first time since stepping off that private elevator, Jamal looked genuinely terrified. The arrogant, untouchable smirk was entirely wiped from his face. He shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot, his wide eyes darting toward the heavy steel elevator doors, as if he were actively calculating whether he could make a run for it before I called building security. He knew that I finally saw the complete picture. He was not just a pathetic guy who exaggerated his wealth to impress an influencer. He was a dangerous financial predator who had actively gutted an elderly couple's life savings. The true horrific scale of the betrayal finally clicked into place in my mind. They did not just want me to pay for the French estate to keep the family peace. They desperately needed me to pay for it because they had literally gambled their own house away and were completely fundamentally broke. Jamal had drained them dry, and when the massive bill for the luxury wedding came due, he tried to use my corporate credit card as his personal emergency bailout fund. I looked at Jamal, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. Then I looked at my sister, who was staring at him with a tragic mix of confusion and blind devotion. She still believed the money was safe. I realized exactly what had to happen next. I tore my gaze away from the pathetic, trembling figure of my father and the sweating coward hiding behind him. I looked directly at my younger sister. Brittany was sitting on my expensive Italian leather sofa, still picking nervously at the frayed fabric of her gray sweatpants. She looked genuinely confused by the sudden shift in the room's energy. She did not understand the severe gravity of a home equity line of credit. To her, money was just a magical, infinite resource that our parents effortlessly supplied on demand. I kept my voice incredibly calm, almost gentle, as I asked her a single highly pointed question. I asked her if she knew about the $200,000. I asked her if she actively stood by and watched our aging parents leverage their only home to hand a massive pile of cash over to a man she had known for less than 18 months. I expected to see at least a small flicker of guilt in her eyes. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had been kept completely in the dark about the exact source of the wedding funding. But I was severely underestimating my sister's boundless toxic entitlement. Brittany stopped picking at her clothes. She sat up straighter on the couch, lifting her chin with a sudden misplaced surge of absolute pride. She looked at me completely unashamed and loudly declared that, of course, she knew about the money. She spoke with the smug, unwavering authority of someone who believed they had just successfully outsmarted the entire financial world. She proudly stated that it was not a desperate loan at all. In her mind, it was an early, highly exclusive investment in their brilliant future. She began to regurgitate Jamal's ridiculous talking points word for word, sounding like a poorly programmed robot. She told me that Jamal was a technological visionary and that the $200,000 was just minor seed capital for his private cryptocurrency node. Brittany went on to aggressively brag that the financial returns were mathematically guaranteed to hit over 800% by the end of the current fiscal quarter. She smiled condescendingly, tossing her messy hair over her shoulder, and told me that Jamal was already in deep negotiations to purchase a massive ultra-modern mansion in Calabasas for the two of them. She even had the sheer audacity to claim that our parents were going to be generously rewarded with a luxury guest house on the new California property for their unwavering loyalty. She sneered and said our parents actually believed in Jamal's genius, unlike me, the bitter corporate sister who was far too scared to take a real financial risk. As she continued to ramble on about her imaginary luxury estate and her fabricated wealthy lifestyle, I watched Jamal closely out of the corner of my eye. He was no longer just sweating, he was actively panicking. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He took a sudden step forward, raising a shaking hand and sharply telling Brittany to stop talking. But Brittany was far too caught up in her own grand fantasy. She completely ignored his desperate warning, determined to aggressively prove to me that she was about to become the wealthiest, most successful member of our entire family. I let her finish her entire delusional speech without interrupting her once. I wanted every single ridiculous word to hang heavily in the air. I wanted my parents to hear exactly how little their golden child actually cared about their long-term financial security. She viewed their potential bankruptcy and homelessness as nothing more than a minor temporary stepping stone to fund her influencer aesthetic. I did not argue with her. I did not point out the glaring, obvious mathematical impossibilities of an 800% guaranteed return in a crashing crypto market. I simply turned my back on all of them and walked slowly across the expansive living room toward my private home office alcove. The heavy, suffocating silence in the apartment immediately returned, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic click of my designer heels against the imported hardwood floor. I reached my sleek, glass-topped desk and opened the top drawer. I reached inside and pulled out my silver iPad Pro. This single device held the exact forensic financial data I had meticulously compiled during my 6-month investigation. I unlocked the screen with my fingerprint and opened the highly encrypted classified dossier file. I walked steadily back to the center of the living room, holding the tablet comfortably in my left hand. The dynamic in the room had completely fractured into a million pieces. Brittany looked aggressively defiant, crossing her arms over her chest. Jamal looked like he was about to physically collapse onto the floor. And my parents just looked incredibly lost and broken. I ignored my sister entirely and focused my complete attention back on my father. I kept my eyes locked directly on his as I slowly raised the illuminated tablet. I spoke in a clear, authoritative tone that commanded absolute silence in the room. I said, "You took out the home equity line of credit with a private high-risk financial lending firm called Apex Capital. Did you not, Dad?" Richard swallowed hard, his exhausted eyes darting nervously to the glowing silver device in my hand. He slowly, hesitantly nodded his head, confirming the exact name of the lending institution. A cold, deeply victorious smile spread across my face. I looked directly at Jamal, watching the very last ounce of color drain completely from his face. Let us look at what Jamal actually bought with that money. I reached up and tapped the screen mirroring icon on my tablet. A soft chime echoed through the living room as my 85-inch smart television instantly flickered to life. The massive screen, which usually displayed digital artwork, was suddenly transformed into a glaring, high-definition autopsy table for Jamal's entire financial existence. The brightness of the white documents cast a harsh, unforgiving light across the faces of my family members. I swiped my finger across the iPad, pulling up the official subpoenaed bank records from Jamal's primary checking account. I directed my father's attention to the very top line of the spreadsheet. I pointed out the exact date, which was exactly 2 days after he and my mother had signed their lives away on that home equity line of credit. There, in bold black numbers, was an incoming wire transfer for exactly $200,000. The sender was clearly listed as Apex Capital. I looked over at Brittany. She was leaning forward on the sofa, her eyes narrowed desperately, trying to make sense of the corporate accounting spread out before her. For a brief second, she still looked somewhat vindicated seeing the massive number officially deposited into her fiancé's account. But her hollow victory lasted less than 10 seconds. I scrolled down to the very next row of data. I told my family to look closely at what happened less than 24 hours after that $200,000 cleared. I highlighted a massive outbound wire transfer. It was not a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange. It was not a technology incubator in Silicon Valley. It was not a down payment on a luxury mansion in Calabasas. I read the destination out loud, letting my voice project clearly across the silent room. The transfer was for exactly $150,000. The recipient institution was the Bellagio Resort and Casino in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the specific routing department attached to the wire was the Casino Credit and Collections Division. My father let out a strange, choked gasp. He stumbled backward, his knees actually buckling for a moment before he caught himself on the edge of the leather armchair. He stared at the television screen as if it were a physical monster. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror. I turned to Brittany and calmly explained the harsh reality of her billionaire tech mogul. I told her that Jamal did not have exclusive insider knowledge about a revolutionary blockchain protocol. He did not have venture capital investors. What he actually had was a massive, uncontrollable gambling addiction. I explained that high rollers at luxury casinos are frequently issued markers which are essentially lines of credit extended by the casino to keep them at the tables. Jamal had clearly gone on a massive baccarat or blackjack bender in Las Vegas, completely maxed out his casino credit and lost every single penny. I looked right at Jamal. I told my family that in the state of Nevada, unpaid casino markers are not just considered civil debt. They are treated as felony bank fraud. Jamal was facing serious imminent prison time from the local authorities in Las Vegas if he did not settle his outstanding balance immediately. So he panicked. He flew back to the East Coast, played the role of the visionary tech founder, and successfully manipulated my desperate status-obsessed parents into handing over the entire equity of their suburban home. He took their retirement safety net and instantly wired it directly to the Bellagio to save himself from a felony conviction. The room erupted. Jamal completely lost whatever tiny fraction of composure he had left. The panic in his eyes turned into a frantic, cornered rage. He began sweating profusely, dark wet patches rapidly spreading across the collar and underarms of his ruined dress shirt. He lunged forward, physically positioning himself between my family and the giant television screen, as if his body could somehow block out the undeniable truth radiating from the display. He started shouting at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was a liar. He yelled that I had maliciously hacked into the banking system to frame him. He wildly claimed that the documents on the television were completely fabricated, photoshopped by a jealous woman who could not stand to see her sister happy. He practically begged Richard and Susan to look at him, swearing on his life that the money was safely locked away in a secure offshore crypto node. But his frantic screaming only made the truth more painfully obvious. He was a drowning man grasping at air. And we were not done looking at the bank statement. I completely ignored Jamal and his frantic, ear-piercing screams. He was pacing wildly in front of the television, waving his arms and shouting that I was a malicious hacker, desperately trying to convince my parents that the federal banking documents were nothing more than a jealous digital fabrication. I did not argue with him. I did not defend the authenticity of the wire transfer logs. When a cornered animal is thrashing around in a trap of its own, making the most effective strategy is to simply stand back and let it exhaust itself. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on my silver tablet. I placed 2 fingers on the smooth glass screen and slowly pinched outward, zooming in on the lower half of the financial spreadsheet. I waited for Jamal to pause and take a breath. When a brief second of silence finally broke through his hysterical ranting, I spoke with absolute chilling clarity. I reminded the room that the home equity line of credit my parents took out was for exactly $200,000. I pointed to the television screen and noted that the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas only took $150,000 of that total amount. I looked directly at my father, who was still slumped heavily against the leather armchair, and asked him a simple math question. I asked him where the remaining $50,000 went. Jamal immediately tried to start shouting again, but my father suddenly shot his hand up, silencing the fraudster with a single furious glare. Richard was finally waking up from the delusion. He turned his exhausted eyes back to the glowing 85-inch screen, demanding to see the rest of the ledger. I scrolled down to the next cluster of transactions. I highlighted a rapid series of massive recurring charges that had systematically drained the account over the course of just 8 weeks. The total amount came out to exactly $45,000. I read the name of the vendor out loud. It was an exotic automotive leasing group located in Miami, Florida. It was the exact same luxury rental agency that the internet sleuths had exposed on social media just a few hours prior. I turned to my parents and translated the data for them. I explained that Jamal did not own a single vehicle. I told them that their hard-earned retirement equity, the money they had bled for over 30 years to build, went directly into paying the daily rental fees for a bright green Lamborghini and a matte black McLaren. Jamal had literally taken out a mortgage on their suburban home just so he could take photos sitting on the hoods of cars he did not own, desperately trying to maintain his fake billionaire aesthetic on the internet. He burned their house down to buy likes from strangers. My mother let out a quiet, devastated sob, finally burying her face in her hands. But I was not finished. I tapped the screen one final time. I told the room that there was still exactly $5,000 left unaccounted for from the original loan amount. I scrolled to the very bottom of the bank statement. There was one final isolated transaction made just 3 days after the home equity loan cleared. It was a charge at a boutique jeweler located in the downtown Diamond District. I shifted my attention away from the television screen and looked directly at my younger sister. Brittany was frozen on the sofa. Her right hand was instinctively covering her left hand, hiding the massive, sparkling engagement ring she had aggressively flaunted at every single family gathering for the past year. This was the same ring she had shoved in my face at Thanksgiving. The same ring she claimed was a flawless custom-cut diamond imported directly from a private dealer in Antwerp. The ring she had loudly bragged cost over $100,000, using it as the ultimate proof that she had secured a highly successful, wealthy man, while I was just a sad, single corporate worker. I asked Brittany to hold up her hand. She refused, pressing her hands tighter against her chest, her face completely drained of color. I did not need her to show it. I simply read the jeweler's itemized invoice right off the screen. I told my sister that the transaction was not for a custom diamond. It was a factory-ordered lab-created cubic zirconia set in a cheap, mass-produced metal alloy band. The total cost of the ring was exactly $4,999. Jamal had taken the very last scrap of our parents' stolen money and bought her a worthless piece of shiny glass. He gave it to her just to keep her docile, invested, and entirely compliant in his massive financial scam. The profound realization hit Brittany like a physical blow. The entire foundation of her superiority complex, her social media aesthetic, and her supposed fairy tale romance completely shattered in an instant. She slowly lowered her hands to her lap. She looked down at the heavy, oversized stone on her finger. Without the blinding filter of her delusion, the light catching the jewel suddenly looked incredibly dull, fake, and artificial. Her hands began to shake violently. She grabbed the edge of the cheap alloy band and slowly pulled the ring off her finger, holding it up in the air as if it were a highly infectious disease. She stared at it in absolute horror. The golden child was sold a cubic zirconia lie. The cheap metal alloy of the fake ring hit the hardwood floor with a hollow, pathetic ping. That tiny sound was the final trigger. The absolute shock that had paralyzed my father for the last 10 minutes instantly mutated into a violent, uncontainable rage. Richard had spent his entire life valuing social status above all else. He had sacrificed his relationship with me, his retirement, and his own home just to buy his way into a higher tax bracket. Realizing he had traded his entire existence for a lab-created rock and a handful of casino markers absolutely broke him. Richard let out a raw, animalistic shout. He lunged across the space between the armchair and the television, closing the distance before Jamal could even react. My father grabbed 2 fistfuls of Jamal's wrinkled, sweat-stained dress shirt, twisting the fabric tightly around his collar. The fragile, toxic alliance that had united them against me completely disintegrated right there in my living room. Richard shook the younger man violently, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. He screamed, spitting as he spoke, demanding that Jamal return every single penny of the $200,000 immediately. He threatened to kill him, to call the police, to tear him apart with his bare hands if the money was not returned. But Jamal was no longer trying to play the part of the respectful, wealthy future son-in-law. The polished tech executive persona completely vanished, replaced by the desperate, vicious street corner hustler he truly was. Jamal did not cower. He did not apologize. Instead, he raised both of his arms and shoved my father squarely in the chest with brutal force. Richard, a man in his late 60s, stumbled backward uncontrollably, his dress shoes slipping on the polished wood. He crashed heavily into the side of the leather sofa, barely catching himself before hitting the floor. Brittany screamed, reaching out for our father, but Jamal simply straightened his ruined collar and let out a harsh, cruel laugh. It was a cold, venomous sound that echoed through the penthouse. He looked down at my father with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He told Richard to back off before he actually got hurt. Jamal paced back and forth, mocking them. He pointed at my parents and called them pathetic, gullible boomers. He laughed at how incredibly easy it had been to scam them. He said all he had to do was wear a leased watch and throw around a few fake corporate buzzwords, and they practically begged him to take the equity right out of their house. Jamal looked directly at Brittany, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the couch. He sneered and told her that she was the easiest mark of all. He said she was so desperate to be a famous influencer, so completely obsessed with looking wealthy on the internet, that she never once asked to see a single real bank statement. He told her she was a shallow, stupid girl who cared more about the aesthetic of a Parisian wedding than the man she was actually marrying. Richard pulled himself up from the edge of the sofa, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and pure panic. He told Jamal he was going to the authorities. He said he would drag him into federal court and force him to liquidate his company to get their retirement funds back. Jamal just threw his head back and laughed again. He spread his arms wide, looking around my luxurious apartment, and delivered the final crushing blow. He told my father there was absolutely nothing left to liquidate. He said the casino took the cash, the rental agencies took the rest, and his personal bank accounts were entirely frozen by the federal government. He looked my father dead in the eye and clearly stated that the money was gone forever and there was absolutely no way to get it back. The finality of those words hung in the air like a death sentence. The reality of their situation finally crushed the last remaining pillar of denial. My mother, who had been standing rigidly near the edge of the room in a state of absolute shock, let out a long, agonizing wail. Her legs gave out completely beneath her. Susan dropped heavily to her knees on the hardwood floor, her hands clutching her face as she rocked back and forth. She did not care about her daughter's broken heart. She did not care about the fake diamond or the cancelled wedding in France. The only thing that mattered to Susan in that moment was her own catastrophic ruin. She sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She wailed that they were going to lose the house. She looked up at my father, her face twisted in absolute despair, and screamed that they were going to be thrown out on the street because there was absolutely no way they could ever afford to make the massive monthly loan payments to Apex Capital. I walked slowly away from the television screen and took a seat on the opposite end of my Italian leather sofa. I simply sat there and watched them. It was a pathetic, tragic display of consequences finally catching up to a lifetime of terrible decisions. Susan was sobbing uncontrollably on the polished hardwood floor, her hands clutching her face as the reality of her impending homelessness set in. Richard was leaning heavily against the wall, clutching his chest and taking short, panicked breaths as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Brittany was staring blankly at her bare ring finger, completely catatonic. Jamal was pacing back and forth near the elevator doors like a caged animal, desperately searching for a way out of the disaster he had orchestrated. I let them sit in their self-inflicted misery for a full minute. I wanted them to deeply feel the absolute weight of their new reality. I wanted the silence of the room to be broken only by their own weeping and heavy breathing. When I decided that they had suffered enough in that specific moment, I raised my hands and clapped exactly once. The sound was incredibly loud and sharp, echoing like a gunshot across the quiet penthouse. The sudden commanding noise instantly snapped all four of them out of their respective meltdowns. Susan stopped wailing, looking up at me with mascara-stained cheeks. Richard stood up straight, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Brittany and Jamal completely froze in place. I kept my posture entirely relaxed. I leaned back comfortably into the soft leather cushions and crossed my legs elegantly. I looked down at my mother, who was still kneeling on the floor, and told her that her assessment of the situation was completely accurate. I confirmed that she was in fact going to lose her beautiful suburban house. My father desperately tried to muster a weak, pathetic defense. He stepped forward, stammering that they still had 30 days until the very first payment on the loan was due. He claimed that he could call his old friends, pull some favors, and figure something out to make the minimum payment. He was still desperately clinging to the delusion that he was a powerful man in control of his finances. I smiled at him without showing any teeth. I told Richard that he clearly did not bother to read the terms and conditions of the high-risk contract he had signed. I explained that private equity lenders do not operate like friendly neighborhood credit unions. They embed extremely strict, aggressive clauses into their agreements to protect their capital from bad investments. One of those specific clauses is a mandatory use of funds verification. I kept my voice perfectly steady, adopting the exact tone I use when dismantling a failing corporate portfolio. I told my father that when you borrow $200,000 under the pretense of investing in a legitimate technology startup, and those funds are immediately wired to a casino to settle an illegal gambling debt, you trigger an instant breach of contract. You do not get a 30-day grace period when you commit financial fraud. I continued my explanation, ensuring every single word cut deep. I pointed out that Jamal being actively indicted for federal wire fraud also triggered a material adverse change clause in the loan agreement. Because my parents had willingly co-signed and transferred their money to a known criminal, the lender legally considered the entire loan to be in immediate default. I told Richard that they do not get to simply scrape together a minimum monthly payment anymore. The entire balance of $200,000, plus exorbitant penalty fees and massive interest rates, is due immediately. And since my father had just openly admitted that his credit cards were completely maxed out and his bank accounts were entirely drained just to fly home from France, I knew he had absolutely no way to satisfy the massive debt. The last tiny spark of hope extinguished completely in my father's eyes. The color drained from his face until he looked physically ill. He finally realized the terrifying legal trap he had blindly walked his family into. He understood that there was no negotiation, no extension, and no magical financial bailout coming to save them. He looked at me, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated panic. He cried out that they had nowhere else to go. He yelled that Apex Capital is going to foreclose on us. I remained perfectly still on the leather sofa. I did not blink. I looked at the man who had stolen my college education, at the mother who had allowed me to be abused, and at the sister who had treated me like disposable garbage her entire life. I smiled coldly. Yes, I said, because I am the primary equity partner at Apex Capital. The absolute silence that followed my statement was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the suffocating, terrifying silence of a complete and total paradigm shift. All the air had been vacuumed out of my penthouse. Susan stopped rocking back and forth. Her mascara-stained face froze, her mouth slightly open as the words slowly processed in her brain. Richard looked as if he had been physically struck by a freight train. His arms hung limply at his sides, his chest barely moving. Over by the elevator, Jamal looked like he was going to vomit. The arrogant con artist finally understood that he had not outsmarted a gullible suburban family. He had walked them directly into a carefully laid corporate trap, designed and executed by the exact woman he had spent the last 2 days trying to actively intimidate. I did not rush the moment. I sat comfortably on my leather sofa and let the crushing realization wash over them. I wanted them to remember this specific feeling for the rest of their lives. When I was finally ready to break the silence, I kept my voice incredibly calm and conversational. I looked at my father and explained exactly how this happened. I told Richard that Apex Capital processes hundreds of private equity loans every single month. Most of them are approved or denied by automated algorithms. But loans that carry an exceptionally high-risk profile are automatically flagged and sent to the senior partners for manual review. About 2 months ago, a very specific application crossed my desk. It was a request for a $200,000 home equity line of credit. The property listed as collateral was a 4-bedroom colonial house in my exact hometown. I watched Richard flinch as I described his home. I continued explaining that when I opened the digital file, I immediately recognized the signatures at the bottom of the contract. I saw my own parents' names. But what truly caught my attention was the intended use of the funds. The application clearly stated that the money was going to be funneled directly into an unverified, unregistered cryptocurrency startup run by a man I already knew was a complete fraud. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I told my parents that I had a choice in that moment. As a senior partner, I could have simply pressed a single red button, denied the application, and protected them from their own staggering stupidity. I could have called them and warned them that Jamal was running a scam, but I knew exactly how that conversation would go. I knew they would call me jealous. I knew they would accuse me of trying to sabotage Brittany's happiness. I knew they would simply take their business to a much more dangerous, predatory lender in the criminal underworld to get the cash. So I did not press the red button. Instead, I approved the loan. Susan let out a sharp, choked gasp, finally finding her voice. She looked up at me from the hardwood floor and whispered that I set them up. She accused me of laying a trap to intentionally destroy them. I shook my head slowly. I told my mother that I did not set a trap. I simply allowed them to dig their own grave without interrupting. I explained that after the corporate loan was officially approved and the funds were transferred, I made a private financial maneuver. I utilized a secondary holding company that I personally own to purchase the debt outright from Apex Capital. I told them that the firm does not own the lien on their house anymore. I do. I hold the absolute legal right to the property. I am their sole creditor. Brittany finally spoke. Her voice was a hollow, empty whisper. She looked around the luxurious penthouse, the expensive artwork, the custom furniture, and then she looked at me. She finally realized the massive, insurmountable gap between us. She asked what would happen to her childhood bedroom. She asked where she was supposed to go. I looked at the golden child, the sister who had told me to watch her wedding on a computer screen, and I told her that was absolutely not my problem. She could move into Jamal's imaginary mansion in Calabasas for all I cared. Jamal immediately tried to physically distance himself from the family. He took a step toward the elevator and nervously stated that the house was in Richard and Susan's name, meaning the default was entirely their problem. He literally tried to wash his hands of the very people who had just destroyed their lives for him. My father turned and looked at Jamal, the absolute betrayal finally breaking his spirit into a million unrecoverable pieces. The man they had worshipped had just thrown them completely under the bus the second the money dried up. Richard took a shaky step forward. His voice was completely broken, stripped of all the patriarchal authority he had wielded like a weapon for over 30 years. He looked at me with tears welling in his eyes and begged me to reconsider. He pleaded with me, saying that I could not possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. He tried to invoke the concept of family loyalty, promising they would find jobs and pay me back every single month. I stood up from the leather sofa. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I looked right into his crying eyes and reminded him that just 10 minutes ago, he was aggressively threatening to sue me for everything I had. I reminded him that he stole my college fund. I told him that the time to make things right expired the moment he demanded I write a check to cover a gambling debt. I walked over to my glass-topped desk. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. I walked back across the room and stopped directly in front of my father. I held the envelope out toward him. His trembling hands slowly reached up and took it from my grasp. "This is your 30-day notice to vacate my property." My father stared down at the thick manila envelope in his trembling hands as if it were a highly venomous snake. The sharp rustle of the paper was the only sound in the room until my mother finally broke completely. Susan did not just cry. She entirely abandoned whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left. She scrambled across the polished hardwood floor on her hands and knees. The woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at me, aggressively criticizing my career and my choices, was now literally crawling at my feet. She reached out and grabbed the fabric of my tailored trousers, her tears leaving dark, wet streaks on the silk. She begged for mercy. She sobbed uncontrollably, gasping for air between her desperate, frantic pleas. She wailed about family. She cried about blood. She looked up at me with a face twisted in sheer terror and begged me to remember that she was my mother. She swore that they had always loved me, claiming they simply made a foolish mistake because they desperately wanted Brittany to have a beautiful wedding. She cried that I could not possibly throw my own flesh and blood out onto the street, begging me not to abandon them to the harsh reality of homelessness. I did not feel a single pang of guilt. I looked down at her hands, gripping my clothes, and I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her to let go. I looked at the three of them, my parents and my sister, who were now entirely broken by the very system they tried to manipulate. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any anger or sorrow. I delivered the cold, hard truth they had spent over 30 years avoiding. I told Susan to stop using the word family as a weapon. I reminded them of the day I turned 18. I asked them where their deep sense of family loyalty was when they secretly drained my entire $40,000 college fund to pay for a high-priced lawyer to keep Brittany out of jail. I reminded them of the years I spent working 3 exhausting jobs, eating cheap noodles, and drowning in predatory student loans, while they bought my younger sister a brand new luxury car. I looked directly at my father and asked him where his loyalty was when he cornered me in the kitchen last Thanksgiving, actively manipulating me into putting a $150,000 charge on my corporate card just to keep the peace. Then I brought up the email. I looked at Brittany, who was still staring blankly at the floor. I reminded them that less than 3 days ago they had happily endorsed an email telling me that my very presence was too toxic for their perfect Parisian aesthetic. They aggressively demanded my money to secure a luxury French estate, but they told me I was only allowed to watch the celebration through a Google Earth window. I looked back down at my mother, who was now weeping silently into her hands. I told her that she did not care about my feelings when I was uninvited from the wedding, and she only cared about my bloodline now, because I held the deed to her house. I delivered the final verdict with absolute conviction. I said, "Family did not do this to you. Your greed did." The devastating truth of my words settled over them like a heavy winter freeze. There was absolutely no argument left to make. My parents had played their final hand and lost everything. But while the 3 of them were completely consumed by their own financial and emotional ruin, the 4th person in the room was quietly making his move. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near the foyer. Jamal had used my mother's hysterical breakdown as a highly convenient distraction. He was slowly, carefully backing away from the group, inching his way toward the heavy, brushed steel doors of the private elevator. His eyes were darting nervously around the room, his hand reaching out blindly behind him to press the call button. The arrogant tech executive was completely abandoning his fiancée and her ruined parents. He thought he could just slip away into the massive labyrinth of New York City and disappear, leaving my family to face the massive debt he personally created. He pressed the glowing button, and the soft chime of the elevator echoed through the penthouse. The doors began to slide open. Jamal took a quick step backward, turning his body to make his grand escape. I did not move from my spot in the living room. I simply raised my voice, just enough to stop him dead in his tracks. I told Jamal that he really did not want to step into that elevator just yet. He froze, instantly looking back at me with a panicked, desperate expression. I smiled coldly and informed him that he should probably wait right here because the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been actively tracking his cell phone for the last 3 days. Jamal's hand hovered over the illuminated elevator button. The sheer terror in his eyes confirmed that he knew his time was completely up. Before he could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse or deny my claim about the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a loud, heavy series of knocks echoed from the opposite end of the penthouse. It was not a polite, casual tapping. It was the sharp, authoritative pounding of people who were entirely prepared to break a door down if it was not opened immediately. I walked past my mother, who was still weeping softly on the hardwood floor, and moved toward the main entrance of my apartment. I reached out and unlocked the heavy custom doors, pulling them wide open. Standing in the hallway was the head of my building security team, a highly disciplined former police officer who strictly managed the privacy of the penthouse level. Flanking him on either side were two broad-shouldered men in dark conservative suits. They did not look like venture capitalists. They looked exactly like what they were. The heavy gold badges clipped to their belts caught the bright light of the hallway. The lead federal agent stepped across the threshold, his eyes scanning the luxurious living room before locking directly onto the sweating, disheveled man standing by the private elevator. The agent's voice was deep, commanding, and left absolutely no room for negotiation. He loudly called out Jamal's full legal name. Jamal physically recoiled, pressing his back flat against the brushed steel doors of the elevator, as if he could somehow phase through the metal and disappear. He raised both of his hands in a weak defensive posture, stammering incoherently. The two federal agents did not hesitate. They marched straight across my polished floors, closing the distance in mere seconds. The lead agent grabbed Jamal by the arms, spinning him around with practiced efficiency, and shoved him face first against the wall. The agent began reciting a devastating list of federal charges in a loud, clear voice that carried across the entire apartment. He stated that Jamal was officially under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, interstate financial embezzlement, and the deliberate defrauding of financial institutions. But the charges did not stop at financial crimes. The second agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and added the most damaging violation of all. He told Jamal that he was also being charged with a severe violation of his active bail conditions. The agent explicitly noted that Jamal had attempted to flee the jurisdiction of the United States by booking an international flight to Paris, France, while his personal assets were entirely frozen under a federal court order. As the cold steel tightened around his wrists, Jamal's cowardly nature fully took over. He desperately tried to throw my father under the bus, babbling frantically to the agents that Richard was the one who willingly handed over the $200,000, claiming it was a voluntary family gift and not an investment scam. The lead agent simply ignored his pathetic attempt to shift the blame, aggressively tightening the cuffs until Jamal winced in pain. The sharp metallic click of the handcuff snapping shut sounded like a final judgment. It was the exact moment the grand illusion violently collided with physical reality. The sound of the locking steel finally snapped Brittany out of her catatonic shock. She leaped off the Italian leather sofa, her face contorted in a mask of absolute hysteria. She ran across the room, throwing herself toward the federal agents in a desperate, entirely unhinged attempt to stop the arrest. She screamed at the top of her lungs, wildly grabbing at the sleeve of the lead agent's suit jacket. She wailed that they were making a massive mistake. She shrieked that Jamal was a highly successful technology executive, a multi-millionaire who was about to buy them a mansion in Calabasas. She demanded that they release her fiancé immediately, loudly, threatening to sue the federal government for ruining her perfect life. The second agent smoothly stepped in front of Brittany, raising a stern hand to block her path. He did not yell, but his tone was incredibly sharp. He warned her that if she continued to physically interfere with an active federal arrest, she would be placed in handcuffs right next to him and charged with obstruction of justice. That single threat was enough to break her completely. Brittany stumbled backward, her knees buckling just like our mothers had minutes earlier. She collapsed onto the floor, letting out a series of agonizing, hyperventilating sobs. She watched helplessly as her supposed billionaire ticket to high society was forcefully marched toward the front door. Jamal did not even look back at her. He did not offer a single word of comfort or an apology to the woman he had promised the world. He kept his head completely down, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, looking like the pathetic, broken criminal he truly was. The agents escorted Jamal out into the hallway, leaving a heavy, stunned silence in their wake. My family was entirely destroyed. Their golden child was weeping on the floor, their life savings were gone, their house was in my possession, and their precious future son-in-law was currently on his way to a federal holding cell. I turned away from the open doorway and looked at my head of security, who was still standing quietly in the foyer. I gestured toward my father, my mother, and my sister. I kept my voice perfectly calm and emotionally detached as I delivered my final instruction. I asked security to please escort the rest of my guests out of my building. The seasons quickly changed, bringing a sharp autumn chill to the streets of New York City. For most people, the arrival of November brings the warm anticipation of the holiday season. But for anyone who grew up in a deeply toxic household, the holidays usually bring a creeping, suffocating sense of dread. It had been exactly 1 year since the Thanksgiving dinner, where my father first pulled me into the kitchen to demand I pay for the Parisian wedding venue. It was a deeply poetic anniversary. I was sitting in my quiet, pristine apartment enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of my Saturday morning when my cell phone vibrated against the marble counter. It was a text message from a completely unknown number. I opened the notification and immediately recognized the frantic, emotionally manipulative tone. My mother had apparently borrowed a coworker's phone at her new minimum wage retail job just to bypass my strict block list. The message was a massive block of text, completely devoid of any genuine accountability or apology. Instead, Susan leaned heavily into the classic holiday guilt trip. She wrote that it was Thanksgiving week, a time for forgiveness and family unity. She described their miserable living situation in highly graphic detail, complaining about the broken heater in their cramped apartment. She made sure to mention that Brittany was forced to work a double shift at the mall cosmetic kiosk just so they could afford to buy a cheap frozen turkey for dinner. Susan explicitly demanded that I be the bigger person. She claimed that my father was deeply depressed and that they had all suffered enough for what she casually referred to as a simple misunderstanding. She actually had the sheer audacity to suggest that I should invite them to my penthouse for a holiday dinner. She heavily hinted that I could easily afford to write them a small check to help them get back on their feet, now that I had recovered my money from the sale of the house. It was the exact same cycle they had trapped me in for over 3 decades. They create a massive disaster, blame me for not fixing it fast enough, and then demand my money under the sacred guise of family loyalty. In the past, a message exactly like that would have completely ruined my entire week. I would have felt that familiar heavy pit of anxiety forming in my stomach. I would have debated responding, perhaps even sending them a small amount of money, just to silence the overwhelming guilt they had systematically programmed into my brain since childhood. But as I read those desperate manipulative words on my screen, I realized something incredibly profound. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger. There was no guilt. There was no sadness. There was just a cool, detached indifference. I did not type out a furious reply. I did not engage in a debate to point out that they were only eating a frozen turkey because they willingly handed their house over to a federal criminal. Engaging with toxic people only proves to them that they still have a hook buried deep in your emotions. The greatest revenge you can ever achieve against a narcissist is absolute silence. I tapped the contact information on the unknown number. I pressed block caller. Then I deleted the entire message thread from my phone. It took less than 5 seconds to permanently erase the last remaining connection to my past. The psychological freedom of completely cutting that cord is almost impossible to describe until you actually do it. For anyone listening who is currently agonizing over setting boundaries with abusive relatives, I need you to understand this absolute truth. You do not owe your peace of mind to the people who actively try to destroy it. Sharing genetics with someone does not give them a lifelong, unrestricted pass to disrespect you, steal from you, or manipulate your kindness. Walking away from my family was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of profound self-preservation. The toxic weight that had pressed down on my shoulders for my entire life was completely gone. I did not have to pretend to be a smaller, quieter version of myself just to make my sister feel better about her own failures. I did not have to constantly audit my bank accounts to see how much of my hard-earned money my parents were going to demand next. I owned my home, I owned my career, and for the first time in 33 years, I completely owned my own future. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and walked out of the living room. The holiday was approaching, and the weather in New York was getting uncomfortably cold. I opened the heavy doors of my walk-in closet and pulled out my favorite piece of designer luggage. I set the suitcase down on my perfectly made bed and unzipped the main compartment. I was not staying in Manhattan for Thanksgiving. I had a flight to catch. As I stood over my open suitcase in the quiet sanctuary of my bedroom, carefully folding my silk dresses and cashmere sweaters, a sudden vibration disrupted the peace. My personal cell phone was completely silent, secured by the permanent block I had placed on my mother's unknown number just moments ago. But this vibration came from my secure corporate phone resting on the nightstand. I walked over and picked up the device. My mother had actually called the main reception desk at my wealth management firm, manipulated a junior assistant with a fabricated family emergency, and managed to bypass the screening protocol to leave a direct voicemail on my executive line. I did not press play. I simply read the automated text transcription that populated on the screen. The message was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Susan did not mention the federal fraud. She did not mention the stolen college fund, the fake diamond ring, or the eviction she brought upon herself. Instead, she leaned heavily into the cultural expectation of female guilt. She cried about the Thanksgiving holiday, painting a pathetic picture of my father sitting in a freezing apartment staring at a blank wall. She claimed that my sister was crying herself to sleep every single night. She begged me to remember that I was the older sister, the strong one, the one who was supposed to absorb the pain and hold the family together. She ended the message by stating that no matter how much money I made, I would never be truly happy without my blood relatives by my side. I read the transcribed words twice, analyzing them with cold precision. For generations, society has conditioned women to be the ultimate peacekeepers. We are taught from a very young age that it is our absolute duty to swallow our pride, ignore our boundaries, and literally set ourselves on fire just to keep our toxic family members warm. We are expected to absorb their abuse, finance their massive mistakes, and smile politely through the holidays just to maintain the fragile illusion of a happy home. But standing in my penthouse, completely financially independent and emotionally detached, I recognized that societal expectation for exactly what it was: a trap designed to keep strong women compliant. I tapped the screen of my corporate phone, forwarded the audio file directly to my firm's security department, and instructed them to permanently block her voice profile from our entire telecommunications network. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I felt an overwhelming, radiant sense of psychological freedom. There is a profound, terrifying beauty in realizing that you hold the absolute power to permanently evict toxic people from your life. The exact moment you stop seeking validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it, you become completely untouchable. My family had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was difficult, cold, and unlovable, simply because I refused to be their endless financial resource. They labeled me the black sheep because I built a fortress of boundaries that their manipulation could not penetrate. But the truth is, being the black sheep is not a punishment. It is an absolute privilege. It means you are the only one strong enough to walk away from the dysfunction. I walked back to my bed and looked down at my perfectly packed luggage. Every single item inside was purchased with money I had earned through my own relentless hard work and sharp intellect. There were no stolen funds, no maxed-out credit cards, and no fraudulent loans. My wealth was real, but more importantly, my peace was entirely real. I did not owe them my success. I did not owe them my sanity. And I certainly did not owe them a seat at my holiday table. I carefully placed my leather toiletry bag inside the main compartment and secured the internal straps. The weight of my past had officially been severed. The heavy, suffocating chain that had dragged behind me for 33 years was finally cut. I was no longer the unloved daughter desperately trying to buy her parents' affection. I was a highly successful, independent executive who had stared down a federal scam and a family of extortionists, and I had emerged completely victorious. I zipped the designer suitcase, closed the smooth glide of the metal echoing brightly in the quiet room. I grabbed the handle and pulled it off the bed, the wheels rolling silently across the plush carpet. I slipped my dark sunglasses over my eyes, picked up my passport from the dresser, and walked out the front door of my penthouse. The security guard in the lobby nodded respectfully as I passed by holding the heavy glass door open for me. A sleek black luxury car was already waiting at the curb, its engine idling softly in the crisp November air. The driver stepped out and quickly loaded my luggage into the trunk. I slid into the warm leather back seat and looked out the tinted window. I was not just taking a random holiday vacation. I had a very specific flight to catch. The luxury car glided seamlessly down the highway toward John F. Kennedy International Airport. I bypassed the standard security lines and walked directly into the first-class lounge, a glass of champagne waiting for me before I even reached my seat. A few hours later, I was on a direct overnight flight to Charles de Gaulle. I slept soundly the entire way across the Atlantic Ocean, unbothered by guilt, unburdened by family drama, and entirely focused on the destination ahead. When the wheels touched down in Paris the following morning, the crisp European air felt like an absolute rebirth. I did not have to deal with frantic text messages or coordinate damage control for a fraudulent brother-in-law. A private chauffeur was waiting for me at the terminal, holding a discreet placard with my name. I stepped into the back of the sleek black sedan and watched the stunning French countryside roll by as we drove away from the city. We were not heading to a random luxury hotel. We were driving straight toward the historic limestone facades of the Château de Villette. When my parents and sister were stranded outside these exact iron gates months ago, they assumed I had completely severed my financial connection to the estate. That was not entirely true. As a senior risk consultant, I never just abandon a prime asset. When I logged into my banking portal at the airport that fateful night, I did not just cancel the $150,000 authorization. I immediately contacted the estate manager and officially transferred the massive deposit into a private booking under my own name. I secured the venue for the exact week of Thanksgiving. The heavy wrought iron gates swung open smoothly as my car approached. There was no screaming, no police, and no rejected credit cards. The estate manager, the same man who had bravely stood his ground against Jamal's aggressive posturing, was waiting on the gravel driveway to personally welcome me. He greeted me warmly, completely aware of the irony, and escorted me directly to the grand terrace overlooking the perfectly manicured French gardens. The scene was absolutely breathtaking. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the stone fountains and the sprawling green lawns. But the most beautiful part of the entire picture was not the historic architecture or the expensive floral arrangements. It was the people occupying the space. I was not alone. Over the course of the last few months, I had quietly extended invitations to my real chosen family. Sitting around the elegant terrace tables were my closest friends from college, my most trusted professional mentors, and the senior colleagues who had supported me without hesitation when my sister tried to destroy my career. A white-gloved waiter approached my table and poured me a generous glass of vintage Bordeaux from a $500 bottle. I took a slow sip, letting the rich, complex flavors ground me in the present moment. I looked around at the people laughing, sharing stories, and genuinely enjoying each other's company. There was no frantic posing for social media. There was no desperate need to prove our wealth to strangers on the internet. We were simply living in the reality of our success, celebrating a holiday built on actual gratitude rather than toxic obligation. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the distant sound of a string quartet playing in the courtyard. I realized that the concept of revenge is often entirely misunderstood. People think revenge has to be loud. They think it requires screaming matches, vindictive plots, and public destruction. But that is just a continuation of the chaos. The sweetest, most devastating revenge you can ever achieve against people who wanted to see you fail is to simply go on and live a profoundly beautiful life without them. Financial independence gave me the tactical power to defend myself, but emotional independence gave me the power to actually enjoy my victory. I no longer check my blocked messages. I no longer wonder what my parents are doing in their tiny apartment, or what kiosk my sister is working at today. They made their choices, and they are living out the exact consequences of those choices. I chose to invest in myself to build a fortress of boundaries, and to surround myself with people who value my presence instead of just my pocketbook. If you are watching this and you are currently trapped in a cycle of family toxicity, please know that you possess the absolute right to walk away. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Build your own life. Protect your peace and never apologize for outgrowing the people who refuse to grow with you. Sometimes the trash takes itself out. You just have to be willing to hold the door open. Thanks for listening. The most profound lesson to extract from this saga is that sharing DNA with someone does not entitle them to your peace, your sanity, or your hard-earned financial success. Society frequently weaponizes the concept of family conditioning individuals to tolerate manipulation, extortion, and emotional abuse under the guise of unconditional loyalty. However, this story powerfully shatters the destructive myth that you must willingly set yourself on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. When family members prioritize their superficial social status and internet aesthetic over your fundamental well-being, stepping away is not an act of cruelty, it is a mandatory act of self-preservation. Claire's journey demonstrates that establishing ironclad boundaries is the ultimate defense against both emotional vampires and financial predators. Enabling toxic behavior never fixes the problem, it only bankrupts the enabler. Reality versus the illusion of success. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the catastrophic danger of chasing the mere illusion of wealth. Brittany and her parents were easily seduced and destroyed by a con artist, precisely because they valued the appearance of success over actual substance. They sacrificed their lifelong stability, blindly leveraging their real home, all to buy temporary validation from strangers online. In stark contrast, genuine power and security come from living firmly rooted in reality. True wealth is built on financial literacy, forensic accountability, and quiet, consistent hard work. The ultimate victory over a toxic environment is never found in screaming matches or public retaliation. It is found in removing those toxic elements entirely, reclaiming your autonomy, and building a beautiful, secure life, surrounded only by people who genuinely respect your worth. You possess the absolute right to evict those who disrespect you from the penthouse of your life.